group composed of Argentina, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Malta, Mexico, Pakistan, Republic of Korea, San Marino, Spain, Turkey, and my own country, Italy. Uniting for Consensus is a pro-reform group dedicated to achieving a more democratic, accountable, representative, transparent, and effective Security Council through a comprehensive reform based on better, equitable, and effective representation for all regions. In this framework, addressing the historical injustice towards Africa is a cornerstone for UFC. Last March, UFC presented a comprehensive reform model within the framework of the intergovernmental negotiations. Our model for Security Council reform was conceived with the objective of reaching a viable, achievable, and consensual reform. UFC proposes increasing the number of seats in a reformed Security Council to a maximum of 27, out of which Africa would obtain 6 seats, becoming the group with the largest number of elected seats. Africa's quest for more representation in the Council is legitimate, as it seeks a representation for an entire continent rather than merely satisfying the ambitions of individual states. This is why UFC genuinely supports this endeavor. Distinguished Chair, in 1945, the United Nations counted 51 member states. Today, the UN has 193 member states, making the current composition of the Council geographically imbalanced and numerically insufficient to ensure proper representation of the current realities of the UN membership. The UFC commitment to a truly comprehensive reform of the United Nations Security Council is stronger than ever. Relevant discussions during the current session of the intergovernmental negotiations have shown increasing convergence on a core element of the UFC reform proposal, the expansion of non-permanent seats based on equitable geographical distribution with the aim to redress historical imbalances and ensure a fair representation for underrepresented regional groups and cross-regional groups. At the same time, UFC acknowledges the aspiration of certain member states and regions, namely Africa, to serve for longer periods on the Council. This is why we propose the introduction of longer-term re-electable non-permanent seats to provide continuity of tenure while maintaining a sound system of democratic accountability. In UNFC's model of enlargement to 27 seats, Africa would double its membership, with potentially 3 new members in the longer-term category, which could also result from regional mechanisms of nomination. Our group considers these elements key steps towards a reform for the whole membership, leaving no one behind, grounded on democracy, accountability, and transparency without creating additional and unjustifiable privileged positions at the expense of the international community and in the detriment of the general interest of the UN membership itself. A successful reform must not perpetuate a composition that has proven to be inefficient for nearly 80 years. According to our proposal, all member states, not only few of them, would have a greater chance to sit in the Security Council. Distinguished Chair, Africa's voice is essential in shaping a more inclusive and representative Security Council. The UFC group is convinced that the African continent, as well as many other regions, deserves wider and stronger representation in the UN Security Council. We are committed to finding a practical solution that takes into account the aspirations of the African continent, as well as other regions, through an effective reform, not based on promises that have come to no avail in recent decades in redressing the injustice towards Africa. UFC is committed to ensuring that Africa's perspectives and aspirations are integrated into the reform process and stands ready to further refine its proposal as a result of inputs coming from African states, in line with the flexibility our group has already shown. The UFC group also believes that, regardless of the future composition of an enlarged council, no decision should be taken by the Council concerning Africa without the full involvement of African members at the Council table. Distinguished Chair, to conclude, allow me to acknowledge Africa's significant contributions to international peace and security. The continent has demonstrated admirable courage, leadership, and ownership in addressing global challenges. Uniting for Consensus remains committed to supporting Africa's legitimate quest for greater representation and will continue to work towards achieving a comprehensive and just reform of the Security Council within its proper forum, the intergovernmental negotiation. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to participate in this high-level debate on behalf of the L69, a diverse pro-reform, cross-regional group of developing countries united by the common goal of comprehensive, effective, and transformative reform of the Security Council. We begin by welcoming the timely convening of this high-level debate and the participation of the Secretary-General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, His Excellency Dennis Francis, the President of the General Assembly, as well as the participation of Ms. Mbete of the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and we thank them for their insightful contributions. Mr. President, in 1945, the establishment of the United Nations beckoned a new era of hope for a world that had just emerged from the ashes of a devastating war. At the time, the United Nations comprised 51 member states, 11 of which were Security Council members. With the advancement of decolonization, the membership of the United Nations grew significantly. Today, the membership has nearly quadrupled, expanding to 193 member states. Yet the Security Council's expansion has not yet kept pace with the growth of the UN membership. The Council itself has expanded only once in the non-permanent category in 1965, nearly 6 decades ago. Consequently, the organ primarily responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security is imbalanced and not fit for purpose. The effect of this is that the Council's decision-making process does not adequately reflect the geographically diverse perspectives of the global community, leading to outcomes on occasion that mirror narrow geopolitical interests and perpetuate inequities. This is why this L69 defends the urgent need to improve the composition to include the unrepresented and increase underrepresented regions such as Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Asia-Pacific in both categories of the membership of the United Nations Security Council. The social sciences have clearly established the importance of inclusivity and fairness for institutional legitimacy. There are roughly 8.1 billion people in the world today, but 20% of that 8.1 billion holds near 50% of the Council's 15 seats and 80% of its veto power. Within this context, we underscore that we stand at yet another crossroad in which we must decide to either pivot or remain stagnant. To choose to be stagnant is a false option, as it sets us on the path to atrophy and illegitimacy. The anachronistic composition of the Security Council has been a root cause of the criticisms leveled against it. The issue of Security Council reform cannot be guided by mere power politics. We must recognize that this is a matter which does determine the future credibility and relevance of this institution. When the Security Council fails, the United Nations flounders. Mr. President, it is undisputed that Africa has been subjected to myriad historical injustices, and this has been profoundly elaborated by Ms. Mbete earlier today. The lack of adequate representation in the Security Council, including permanent representation, has stifled African interests and perspectives in critical decision-making processes on many occasions. This must be acknowledged by the international community, and it must also be rectified. To this end, the L69 believes that deference must be given to Africa to guide us on how to do this. The L69 reiterates its unwavering support for the common African position as espoused in the Ezulwini Consensus and Sirte Declaration, which is unambiguously clear about Africa's justified request for fair and just representation in both the permanent and non-permanent member categories. The question of Africa's inclusion in global institutions, particularly the Security Council, is one of legitimacy, credibility, and effectiveness. Representational legitimacy is a necessary condition for good institutional performance, particularly when the subjects of an institution's decisions have little say in the decision-making process itself. It is therefore imperative and frankly urgent for the international community to recognize beyond lip service the unique and critical role that can be played by Africa. Doing so, Mr. President, will work towards transforming the Security Council into an institution that more adequately represents the diverse interests, ambitions, and realities of all member states. Acknowledging the need for improvement is not a failure but a triumph. Recognizing our existing shortcomings and striving to rectify them ensures that the Security Council remains adaptable and relevant in a rapidly evolving world. As the distinguished representative of the United States said earlier, it is indeed time to stop admiring the problem. I thank you.
I thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for their statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Katarina Clifford, Chargée d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries Turkey, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as San Marino, aligns themselves with this statement. Allow me to congratulate Sierra Leone on your presidency of the Security Council for the month of August. The EU is honored to have been invited to participate in this important debate. Mr. President, the African Union and the European Union have a joint vision. At the EU-AU Summit in 2022, we agreed that the aim of the joint vision is to consolidate a renewed partnership for solidarity, security, peace, and sustained and sustainable economic development and prosperity for our citizens and for our future generations, bringing together our people, regions, and organizations. As closest neighbors, Africa and Europe have a shared interest in strengthening our links and partnerships in all areas. The EU supports comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council to make it more effective, inclusive, transparent, democratic, and accountable, better reflecting today's realities by strengthening the voice of underrepresented regions, especially but not limited to Africa. The Summit of the Future should reflect progress in the intergovernmental negotiations at UNGA on UN Security Council reform. The EU also supports the French-Mexican initiative on veto restraints in cases of mass atrocities, as well as the Code of Conduct regarding Security Council action against genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The Pact of the Future will contain the input provided by the co-chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council and other related matters to the Security Council. The EU also supports a stronger global African voice and the reinforced presence of the African Union in other multilateral fora. We advocated for an African Union seat at the G20, which was finally achieved last year. More recently, in the ongoing negotiations on the Pact of the Future, we have actively supported reform of the international financial architecture. We know that improved African representation and governance reform is an important priority for Africa. It is also ours. In addition to changes to quotas and voting power, we support other steps to improve the voice and representation of developing countries, such as the creation of a 25th chair on the IMF Executive Board for Sub-Saharan Africa. In order to increase the legitimacy and effectiveness of the multilateral system, governance reform must improve the representation, accountability, and effectiveness of key institutions. Mr. President, the EU is the Africa Union's #1 partner on peace and security issues in terms of political, financial, and technical support. Through the Africa Peace Facility and later the European Peace Facility, we have been particularly strong supporter of African Union-led peace support operations, PSOs. For example, the EU has provided over 2.6 billion euro in support of the AMISOM ATMIS military, police, and civilian components since its deployment in 2007, which makes us by far the largest financial contributor to the mission. We will stay engaged in Somalia and will consider financial support to the new mission through different instruments, together with all security partners of Somalia, and based on a principle of fairer burden sharing. In the same vein, we have also supported the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2719 on financing African Union-led PSOs. Its implementation will strengthen the relationship between the UN Security Council and Africa. At the same time, predictable, adequate, and sustainable financing will benefit operational effectiveness and complement political strategies to end conflicts and support peace and security in Africa. We support the closer UN-AU partnership, and we count on the ongoing dialogue between the two organizations to provide further clarity on its future implementation, including the conclusion of a joint roadmap. The EU stands ready to contribute to these discussions. We call on all international partners, as well as the African Union, sub-regional organizations, and their member states, to contribute significantly to AU-led PSOs authorized by the UN Security Council. The EU, for its part, will seek to continuously play a proactive role in providing support to AU-led PSOs through all the tools at its disposal. This is the core of the EU-AU partnership, as we strongly believe in the need to support each other when our security is under threat, as we are seeing today, both in Africa and in Europe. In conclusion, Mr. President, the European Union will continue to support and advocate for stronger African voice in the UN Security Council and in other multilateral fora. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Clifford for her statement. And I will give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, Al-Hajj Musa Timothy Kaaba, Minister of Foreign Affairs, I would like to extend my gratitude to you and through you to His Excellency Mr. Julius Maada Bio, the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, for presiding over this session, and also to His Excellency Mr. Michael Imran Kanu for organizing this high-level debate. Your leadership in facilitating this discussion underscores Sierra Leone's commitment to advancing international peace and security. It also reflects your commendable efforts to ensure equitable representation within the Security Council. I also extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Dennis Francis, and the civil society representative, Ms. Mbete, for their briefings today. It is a privilege to speak before this esteemed body on behalf of the co-chairs of the Intergovernmental Negotiations, IGN on Security Council Reform, Ambassador Axel Marschik of Austria, and myself. Today's discussion is crucial as we stand at a pivotal moment in the history of the United Nations. It is also a pivotal moment in time where we are witnessing the rise of violence and war, widespread conflicts, and the devastating impacts of such turmoil on innocent lives. These crises are testing the very fabric of our global order and highlighting the urgent need for a Security Council that can respond swiftly and effectively. The call for Security Council reform is not just a procedural necessity. It is a moral imperative and a foundational step towards upholding the principles of justice, peace, security, and the rule of law that the United Nations embodies. Our world is increasingly fraught with complex challenges, rising geopolitical tensions, unprecedented global health crises, climate change, and persistent inequalities. These issues demand a Security Council that is more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, democratic, and accountable. Reforming the Council is not a choice. It is an urgent necessity that must be addressed now. As we approach the summit of the future, the urgent need for reform becomes even more pronounced. The current structure of the Security Council reflects the geopolitical realities of a bygone era, and it is imperative that we adapt it to meet the challenges and dynamics of the 21st century. The world has changed significantly since the inception of the United Nations, and our institutions must evolve accordingly to remain relevant and effective. Africa deserves a more prominent and equitable representation on the Security Council. In the discussions of the IGN, delegations have consistently called to redress the historical injustice against Africa. Africa is central to the Council's work, contributing significantly to peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and global development. The same is said for underrepresented and unrepresented regions such as Asia-Pacific and Latin America and the Caribbean. Addressing this disparity is essential for maintaining international peace and security, as it ensures that the voices and concerns of all regions are adequately represented and heard. The calls for Security Council reform have grown louder and more urgent. We must align all factors, political will, diplomatic efforts, and the collective resolve of the international community to make this reform a reality. It requires a concerted effort to build consensus, navigate the complexities of the issue, and commit to a vision of a Security Council that truly reflects the diversity and plurality of our global community. Now is the time to harness our collective strength and determination to bring about this transformative change. As co-chairs of the IGN, we are tasked with safeguarding the process towards reform. Our mandate is to facilitate dialogue, build convergences, and navigate the complexities of this issue to achieve a more inclusive and representative Security Council. We recognize that the path to reform is fraught with challenges, but we remain committed to this endeavor, driven by the collective aspiration for a more just and equitable international community. This session as IGN co-chairs, we embarked on trips to 7 capitals, engaging with senior officials on Security Council reform. This level of engagement was encouraging and indicative of the international community's commitment for reform. However, politics continues to act as a barrier to achieving further progress in regards to Security Council reform. Now is the time for us to work together, setting aside political differences, to make this long overdue reform a reality. The upcoming Summit of the Future presents a unique opportunity for us to make tangible progress on this front. It is a moment for us to reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism, renew our efforts towards comprehensive reform, and lay the groundwork for a Security Council that truly reflects the diversity and plurality of our global community. In closing, I urge all member states to approach these discussions with a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. Let us seize this opportunity to correct historical injustices, enhance the effectiveness of the Security Council, and strengthen the United Nations as a whole. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to Sierra Leone for convening this important and timely discussion. We extend a warm welcome to His Excellency Dr. Julius Maada Bio, President of Sierra Leone, a country with which Pakistan enjoys close and fraternal relations. We also thank the Secretary General and other speakers for their insightful interventions today. Pakistan aligns itself with the statement delivered by Italy on behalf of the Uniting for Consensus group. In the IGN, Pakistan has presented the perspective of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, and I wish to share this perspective with the Council today, as well as to express Pakistan's views regarding Security Council reform. Mr. President, the UN Security Council structure reflects the 1945 power realities. Most African and most Arab and OIC countries, like the majority of the UN membership, were still under colonial rule at that time. Pakistan achieved independence in 1947 through the exercise of the right to self-determination. And we worked seriously and sincerely for the liberation of African nations from colonial rule on the basis of this fundamental principle. We acknowledge the historic injustice against Africa, its occupation, its oppression, its exploitation. And we also recognize the injustice of the structure of the Security Council, as is other international institutions, including the financial institutions. The Arab and OIC countries, Mr. President, several of which are also African countries, also suffered this historic injustice. We need to find ways to rectify this historic injustice. The decision embedded in the UN Charter to name 5 states as permanent members of the Security Council, whatever its logic and rationale at the time, was contrary to the Charter's own principle of sovereign equality of states. As we have witnessed in recent months, the existence of the veto-wielding permanent members is a principal reason for the Council's frequent inability to take effective collective actions for the maintenance of international peace and security. The problem, Mr. President, cannot be the solution. More vetoes will multiply the prospects of paralysis in the Council. It is for this reason that Pakistan has opposed the addition of new permanent members on the Security Council. The demand of the 4 individual states for permanent membership for themselves is designed to promote their own narrow national interests. This would further intensify the injustice of the present unequal structure of the Security Council and further erode the principle of sovereign equality. At the same time, like the UFC, Pakistan agrees that Africa's demand set out in the Isilvini Consensus for equitable representation of the region of Africa is critically different from the demand of 4 states for permanent membership for themselves. The demands of Africa for regional seats are designed to rectify injustice, not to exacerbate injustice. Thus, we have agreed to the consideration of Africa's demands as a special case. We must seek solutions to accommodate the African demands in ways that would enhance equity and equitable representation for Africa and for all member states of the United Nations. Mr. President, considerable progress has been made in the IGN process, especially this year, in broadening the areas of convergence and reducing the divergences. In our view, there is growing agreement on 4 issues in the IGN process. 1, there should be greater representation of developing countries on the Security Council. 2, the expansion of 2-year non-permanent seats is accepted by all. 3, Africa should be treated as a special case. And 4, all regional and cross-regional groups must be equitably represented to ensure, and I quote, equitable geographical representation. This is the objective indicated in the title of the item on Security Council reform. Mr. President, the regional approach to Security Council reform has been espoused by Africa, by the UFC, by the Arab Group, and the OIC, as well as several other states. The states of Africa, the Arab and Muslim world, were all subjected in greater or lesser degree to the historic injustice of the 1945 structures of the Security Council and other international organizations, including the international financial organizations. The Arab Group has declared repeatedly that the Arab countries must be equitably represented in any category of membership created in the reform of the Security Council. The OIC, most recently at the summit in Banjul, and I quote, reaffirmed its decision that any reform proposal which neglects the adequate representation of the Islamic Ummah in any category of membership in an extended Security Council will not be acceptable to the Islamic world, unquote. Mr. President, speaking for Pakistan, I can say that within the framework of a regional and cross-regional approach, a decision could be taken to create special regional seats to be occupied by states selected by the region and elected by the General Assembly. The regional framework could also indicate, 1, the period for which the designated states could serve on these special seats. 2, whether representation on these seats would be rotated among all or some of the states from that region. Moreover, consideration could be given to the representation of these special seats by regional organizations such as the African Union, the European Union, the Arab League, and the OIC. Such details could be worked on and agreed through consultations and compromise within the IGN process. Mr. President, the Common African Position also says that either the veto power of the existing 5 permanent members should be abolished, and if not, the African permanent seats should be given the same veto rights. This is an understandable position. The question is whether the 5 permanent members will be willing to give up their veto rights, and if not, whether the veto power can be provided to the designated regional seats as demanded by Africa. The envisaged consultations between the C10 and the P5 may yield some clear answers. Some permanent members today have expressed their support for new permanent members. Yet, in our consultations at least, some of these same permanent members have conveyed that they are not prepared to give up their veto right, and, moreover, they are also not prepared to accept the veto power for new permanent members, including any new African permanent members. Unfortunately, each one of these permanent members is in a position to block the adoption of a charter amendment that seeks to take away their veto rights or give the right to others. It is for this reason, Mr. President, among others, that we need to give consideration to proposals for alternative ways to realize the objectives of equity and equitable geographical representation for Africa and other groups. We believe that this is possible within the regional approach to Security Council reform. The UFC has proposed the concept of longer-term and re-electable seats within each region. If Africa and other regions and cross-regions were to contemplate some form of rotation of representation against their special or permanent seats, this objective could be achieved through the concept of longer-term and or re-electable seats. The states occupying these longer-term or re-electable seats could be selected or designated by the region or cross-region itself. Of course, Mr. President, if the veto right of the existing permanent members cannot be abolished, equity demands that it must be severely constrained. Apart from Liechtenstein's veto initiative, which Pakistan supports, various other proposals have been advanced to restrict the use of the veto. There is considerable support for the proposition that the 5 permanent members should be persuaded to offer commitments not to use the veto in the case of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Such a commitment would be essential in the circumstances we face today in the Middle East. Mr. President, there are other ways of balancing the influence of the 5 permanent members. Most importantly, we should ensure that the Council's expansion ensures that the representation of developing countries is significantly enhanced in proportion to their numbers in the UN membership, and that they enjoy a majority in an expanded Council as they do in the General Assembly. A majority in the Council would enhance the influence of developing countries and the Council's elected members. Thus, expansion should be large enough. The UFC has proposed a Council of 27 members to ensure that developing countries have a majority in the Council. The objective of equitable geographical representation may also dictate a concomitant reduction in the size of an overrepresented region. Africa has called for African solutions for African problems. We support the AU's lead role in African peacekeeping operations as set out in Security Council Resolution 2719. Council reform could also provide a requirement for the concurrence of all or a majority of regional states for the adoption of decisions relating to that region. Mr. President, Pakistan is confident that we can evolve an agreed model for Security Council reform and accommodate Africa as a special case by adopting the regional approach. This will require a spirit of flexibility and compromise from all sides. The adoption of the text proposed by the IGN co-chairs for the Pact of the Future and for a rollover decision will advance the prospects of progress towards an agreed outcome on Security Council reform. Attempts to open this issue outside the IGN will prove to be counterproductive. These proposals from the co-chairs should be adopted without further delay. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Through you, Excellency Minister, Kenya's delegation welcomes His Excellency Dr. Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and extends warm congratulations to him on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. We also thank him for convening this debate, which is historic in the Security Council, and commend his pragmatic leadership as chair of the African Union Committee of 10 on United Nations Security Council reform. Kenya fully supports President Bio's efforts to advance the reform agenda to ensure that Africa is equitably represented in the Security Council. And we were truly inspired by the statement he delivered earlier in the debate. Excellencies, no continent has suffered grievous historical injustices more than Africa. History is littered by tragic events meted against Africa and people of African descent over centuries. From slavery and slave trade to colonialism and neo-colonialism, which sadly continue to define the existing world order. Africa was under the yoke of colonialism when the UN Charter and the Bretton Woods institutions were negotiated and agreed upon. Africa was not on the negotiation table. Tragically, it continues to suffer exclusion in the design and construction of the global multilateral order. Most countries in Africa won their independence from colonial rule during the Cold War. Africa became a battleground over superpower rivalry that it had no beneficial stake in. Externally instigated regime changes through armed violence, including military coups, became a commonplace, setting a trend of civil wars and instability that have bedeviled the continent to date. Today, Africa remains unequal in the highest levels of global decision-making. The multilateral system remains skewed to the disadvantage of Africa, partly because of asymmetrical distribution of political, economic, military, and financial power. Despite its numerical strength of 1.3 billion people, and with nearly a third of membership of the UN, Africa's interests continue to be marginalized in the United Nations system. With continued non-representation and under-representation of Africa in the global governance mechanisms, including the UN Security Council, this marginalization is getting worse as powerful countries seek after their own interests. There is no silver bullet that will rectify the continuing historical injustices against Africa. However, in the emerging multipolar order and the transition to net zero global economy, Africa must be an equal partner around the decision-making table. For the UN Security Council, where Africa takes more than half of the agenda, 2 permanent seats and an additional 2 non-permanent seats demanded in the Common African Position would ensure a decent representation of the continent in this august body. Excellencies, your support for this position would be a stand for the foundational principles of the United Nations. After all, it is a justified, modest, and achievable demand to create a representative, democratic, accountable, and effective global security governance system that accommodates the aspirations of all nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. We wish to thank Sierra Leone for convening the Security Council for this important meeting and for the timely opportunity to discuss the representation of Africa in the Security Council. I also wish to thank all the briefers of this morning. Today, the Nordic countries would like to highlight 3 areas of importance. First, as the current global situation represents serious challenges, strengthening multilateralism is key to finding common solutions. When the Nordic and African foreign ministers met in Copenhagen last May, they reiterated our shared commitment to work towards a more inclusive and effective multilateralism with the United Nations at its core. Second, the Nordic countries support a balanced expansion of the Security Council with both permanent and non-permanent seats for the Council to be more representative and to better reflect global political and economic realities of today. We should use the Summit of the Future as an opportunity to transform global governance, and this includes taking steps forward also on the Security Council reform. There is a broad agreement that the Council must become more inclusive, efficient, transparent, and accountable. This also means developing working methods and ensuring equitable distribution of roles and responsibilities. Third, there is now an opportunity to redress the historical injustice done to the African continent. The Nordic countries stand firmly together with their African friends in this reform to ensure that Africa takes its rightful place in the Council through an expansion of both permanent and non-permanent seats for Africa. With African peace and security continuing to take up much of the Security Council's agenda, it is clear that more African voices are needed, and African member states should have a more profound influence over the Council's work. We would like to see more opportunities for the African members of the Council for pen holdership or co-pen holdership. The unanimous adoption of Landmark Security Council Resolution 2719 last December, led by the A3 and supported by all Nordic countries, was a concrete example of the importance of African states in responding to the pressing challenges of peace and security on the African continent and beyond. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Finland for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Señor Presidente, tengo el insigne honor de participar en esta reunión de alto nivel en representación personal de Su Excelencia Obiangama Mbazoa, Presidente de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, quien por razones de compromisos previos de su agenda no ha podido desplazarse a Nueva York y tomar parte en esta reunión como era su deseo. Paso pues a dar lectura de su discurso, cuyo texto es el siguiente. Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Quisiera en primer lugar saludar a mi hermano, Su Excelencia Julius Maada Bio, presidente de la República de Sierra Leona, y felicitarle por asumir la presidencia del Consejo de Seguridad para este mes de agosto de 2024. Le garantizamos el pleno apoyo de Guinea Ecuatorial durante su mandato y liderazgo al frente de este órgano decisorio de la política mundial. Felicitamos esta iniciativa tan acertada de convocar y organizar este importante debate de alto nivel para abordar la injusticia histórica con vistas a elevar y realzar la representación efectiva del continente africano en el Consejo de Seguridad. Expresamos nuestro reconocimiento a los excelentísimos señores Antonio Guterres, secretario general de las Naciones Unidas, y Denis Francis, presidente de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, respectivamente, por vuestro liderazgo y compromiso en buscar soluciones sobre las cuestiones de paz y seguridad globales, particularmente a los temas que conciernen al continente africano. Felicito a la señora Chitembile Mbete por su brillante y detallada presentación informativa sobre los potenciales desafíos y el rol del Consejo de Seguridad, y tomamos muy buena nota al respecto. Excelencias, señoras y señores, llevamos ya varias décadas abordando la necesidad de reformar el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas sin observar progreso tangible alguno, a pesar de la adopción de la resolución de la Asamblea General número 60/1 del 24 de octubre de 2005, que reafirma el compromiso de los Estados miembros de la ONU para llevar a cabo lo antes posible la reforma del Consejo de Seguridad. Esta reforma, que ahora más que nunca se hace relevante y necesaria debido a que las últimas crisis multifacéticas y conflictos que vienen afectando la convivencia pacífica de la comunidad internacional han dejado en evidencia y en entredicho la capacidad del Consejo de Seguridad de cumplir con su responsabilidad primordial, que es mantener la paz y la seguridad en el mundo. Todos aquí presentes hemos descubierto la inutilidad e ineficacia que día a día de hoy está haciendo el Consejo de Seguridad por mantener en su seno su vieja y arcaica estructura de los 5 miembros permanentes con derecho a veto, que lejos de cumplir su misión está permitiendo la proliferación de conflictos bélicos entre países y regiones, como lo que actualmente está ocurriendo en Oriente Próximo. Esta estructura arcaica, establecida después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, refleja un panorama geopolítico que desde entonces ha cambiado drásticamente y se ha vuelto obsoleto. La falta de representación de otras regiones y en especial el continente africano, tanto en las categorías permanentes como no permanentes respectivamente, muestra un anacronismo que socava la legitimidad y la eficacia del Consejo de Seguridad. Además de todo, los miembros permanentes actuales son todos del hemisferio norte, o sea, del norte global, y no incluyen miembros del sur global fuera de Asia. Este desequilibrio distorsiona las perspectivas y prioridades dentro del Consejo de Seguridad, especialmente cuando África, a través de las organizaciones como la Unión Africana y las comunidades económicas regionales, se ha convertido en un actor importante en la diplomacia internacional, la resolución de conflictos y el mantenimiento de la paz. Y a pesar de esto, el continente africano tiene limitado su representación en las principales instituciones de gobernanza global e incluso cuando existe la mínima representación africana, estas quedan marginadas en los procesos de toma de decisiones. De ahí nuestra insistencia y persistencia en que se reforme este Consejo de Seguridad, en el que se apoye y se dé una prioridad y un trato especial a la posición común africana derivada del consenso de Subrini y la declaración de Sirte, esto es, 5 asientos en la categoría de miembros no permanentes y 2 asientos en la categoría de miembros permanentes, con todas las prerrogativas y privilegios incluido en el derecho de veto. La ausencia del continente africano en la membresía permanente de este Consejo de Seguridad perpetúa las injusticias históricas arraigadas en el legado colonial y las continuas interferencias políticas y económicas de las antiguas potencias coloniales y otros actores globales. Esta ausencia obstaculiza significativamente la capacidad del continente para contribuir eficazmente en las instituciones de gobernanza. Por lo tanto, una reforma integral del Consejo de Seguridad debe incluir la representación adecuada del continente africano en la categoría de miembros permanentes. Esto sería un paso importante hacia la rectificación de esta injusticia histórica y el reconocimiento del legítimo lugar de África en la gobernanza global. Nos congratulamos por las muestras de apoyo a favor de la posición común africana por parte de los Estados miembros mediante sus declaraciones durante las sesiones de la Asamblea General y de las negociaciones intergubernamentales, hecho que agradecemos de forma sincera. No obstante, es nuestro mayor deseo de que dichos apoyos se concreticen y se traduzcan en la reforma de este Consejo de Seguridad. Lo mismo vale para los 5 miembros permanentes, quienes casi en su totalidad también han expresado su apoyo a la posición común africana, a los que invitamos para que de manera clara definan estos apoyos y actúen de manera decisiva para que se reforme este Consejo de Seguridad. Concluyo resaltando que, teniendo en cuenta que el mundo ha evolucionado bastante desde el fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial en 1945 hasta la actualidad 2024, han pasado varias décadas. Por tanto, dar prioridad a la posición común africana es promover un Consejo de Seguridad más democrático y capaz de responder de manera efectiva y adecuada a los desafíos que amenazan la paz y la seguridad internacionales y mantener su legitimidad ante los ojos de la comunidad internacional. Muchas gracias. Señor Presidente, este ha sido el texto íntegro del discurso que Su Excelencia Obiangman Bazogo, presidente de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, tenía previsto hacer durante su participación en esta reunión de alto nivel del Consejo de Seguridad. Gracias por vuestra atención.
I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Senegal.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, d'emblée, je voudrais transmettre avec les vives félicitations de Son Excellence Monsieur Bassirou Diakhar Diomaye Faye, les salutations donc du président du Sénégal à son frère et ami, le président de la Sierra Leone, ainsi que ses salutations les plus chaleureuses. Le Sénégal souscrit à la déclaration qui a été prononcée ce matin par M. le Président de la République de Sierra Leone en sa qualité de coordonnateur du comité des 10 chefs d'État et de gouvernement de l'Union africaine en charge de la réforme du Conseil de sécurité. En cette période de crise aiguë, notamment marquée par la résurgence des tensions géopolitiques et l'essoufflement du multilatéralisme, la réforme du Conseil de sécurité s'avère plus que jamais nécessaire. Nul besoin de rappeler que cette réforme s'impose au regard des mutations qui appellent à une gouvernance mondiale plus démocratique, plus inclusive, plus représentative, en somme plus juste. Il est d'autant plus regrettable que le processus de négociation intergouvernementale, engagé depuis 15 ans maintenant, n'a encore débouché sur aucun résultat décisif à ce jour. Néanmoins, l'espoir demeure que cette réforme est possible si nous y mettons la volonté politique nécessaire. Monsieur le Président, il ne saurait y avoir de vraies réformes du Conseil de sécurité sans représentativité régionale ni équité géographique. C'est donc dire que l'élargissement de cet organe dans les deux catégories, au profit des groupes régionaux absents et ou sous-représentés, est une condition sine qua non à l'émergence d'un Conseil plus démocratique, plus équilibré et plus conforme aux buts et principes ainsi qu'à l'esprit de la Charte des Nations Unies. Sous ce rapport, l'injustice faite à l'Afrique, continent absent de la catégorie des membres permanents et sous-représenté dans la catégorie des membres non permanents, doit être réparée. Aussi, permettez-moi de remercier la Sierra Leone pour l'initiative de ce débat, le premier du genre qui nous permet de réfléchir aux voies et moyens de remédier à cette injustice historique. Monsieur le Président, la réforme est urgente, elle est pressante même. Au nom de la justice, elle doit se faire en érigeant l'Afrique au rang de priorité et de cas spécial. Cette injustice doit être corrigée conformément à la position africaine commune. Au nom de l'équité, elle ne saurait se satisfaire de solutions intermédiaires qui relégueraient ces nouveaux membres à des rôles hybrides, pour ne pas dire de second rang. La permanence n'est pas une affaire de privilège, elle est une affaire de représentativité. Et aujourd'hui, il est grand temps que les préoccupations et les vues africaines soient aussi reflétées au Conseil. Monsieur le Président, ces légitimes revendications africaines devront être prises en compte dans le pacte pour l'avenir. Le débat d'aujourd'hui est donc l'occasion pour nous de réitérer notre plein engagement à poursuivre un dialogue franc et ouvert avec toutes les parties prenantes pour concrétiser une réforme qui prenne en compte les préoccupations de tous. C'est dans cet esprit, du reste, que se tiendra la rencontre de haut niveau entre le C10 et le P5. L'Afrique, unie autour de sa position africaine commune et du C10, continuera d'œuvrer sans relâche à la réforme du Conseil afin d'y occuper sa juste place. Monsieur le Président, pour terminer, réparer l'injustice historique faite à l'Afrique est un impératif moral et politique pour ne pas perpétuer un statu quo inique et ne pas ignorer les aspirations légitimes d'un continent qui occupe une part importante de l'agenda du Conseil et représente 28% des États de notre organisation. Tel est le sens de l'histoire. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Senegal for their statement. And I will give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
سيد الرئيس، اسمحوا لي بداية أن نتقدم بجزيل الشكر إلى وفد سيراليون على الدعوة للمشاركة في هذا الاجتماع بصفتنا منسق المجموعة العربية لمسألة إصلاح مجلس الأمن للمشاركة في هذه الجلسة رفيعة المستوى الهامة. ويشرفني أن ألقي هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية، وأود أن أهنئ وفد سيراليون على توليه رئاسة مجلس الأمن لهذا الشهر متمنيا له كل التوفيق والنجاح في إدارة أعمال المجلس خلال الشهر الجاري. كما أرحب بترأس فخامة الرئيس الدكتور جوليوس مادو بيو رئيس جمهورية سيراليون لهذه الجلسة. ولا يفوتني أن أتوجه بالشكر إلى معالي السيد أنطونيو غوتيريس الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة ومعالي السيد دينيس فرانسيس رئيس الجمعية العامة على إحاطتيهما القيمتين. وأشكر كذلك السيدة بيتي من جامعة بريتوريا على إحاطتها كذلك. سيد الرئيس، في ظل ما يشهده العالم من نزاعات وانعدام الأمن والاستقرار خاصة في بعض أجزاء المنطقتين العربية والأفريقية، باتت واضحة الحاجة إلى إصلاح حقيقي وشامل لمجلس الأمن، الجهة المسؤولة عن صون السلم والأمن الدوليين بموجب ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وعلينا أن نكون أكثر تصميماً وإصراراً على تكثيف الجهود الرامية إلى تحقيق الإصلاح المنشود. وقد حرصت المجموعة العربية خلال المفاوضات الحكومية الدولية للجمعية العامة بشأن إصلاح مجلس الأمن باعتباره المحفل الوحيد للتوصل إلى اتفاق حول توسيع وإصلاح مجلس الأمن وفقاً لمقرر الجمعية 62 على 557 على المشاركة بفعالية وإيجابية خلال المفاوضات وانفتاحها للتشاور مع جميع الدول الأعضاء والمجموعات التفاوضية الأخرى بشكل شفاف وبناء. وترى المجموعة العربية أن الهدف الرئيسي والأشمل لعملية الإصلاح هو ضمان أن تكون كافة المجموعات الجغرافية والإقليمية ممثلة بشكل عادل ومناسب في عضوية مجلس الأمن الموسع. ونود التأكيد مجدداً على أهمية تركيز عملية الإصلاح على رفع الظلم الواقع على الدول النامية وخاصة الدول العربية والدول الأفريقية غير الممثلة على الإطلاق بفئة المقاعد الدائمة بمجلس الأمن. وإضافة إلى ذلك فإن عدالة التمثيل تتطلب تمثيلاً متناسباً في فئة المقاعد غير الدائمة في مجلس الأمن الموسع. سيد الرئيس، تنتمي العديد من الدول العربية إلى قارة أفريقيا، وترتبط الشعوب العربية والأفريقية بعلاقات تاريخية وثقافية وسياسية واجتماعية واقتصادية ودينية ولغوية أزلية، شكلت أساس إقامة شراكاتنا الاستراتيجية التي تسعى إلى الحفاظ على العدل والسلام والأمن الدوليين. ومن هذا المنطلق لقد أكدت إعلانات وبرامج عمل مؤتمرات القمة العربية الأفريقية على الالتزامنا القوي بالإصلاح الشامل لمنظومة الأمم المتحدة بما في ذلك مجلس الأمن، بغية عكس الواقع العالمي الحالي وجعله أكثر تمثيلاً وأكثر توازناً إقليمياً وأكثر ديمقراطية وفعالية، بالإضافة إلى تنسيق مواقفنا في هذا الصدد أخذاً في الاعتبار توافق آيزلويني وإعلانات سرت للاتحاد الأفريقي والقرارات ذات الصلة الصادرة عن جامعة الدول العربية تحقيقاً لمصالحنا المشتركة. وأجدد هنا تقديرنا لدور لجنة 10 من رؤساء الدول والحكومات في الاتحاد الأفريقي لدعم وتعزيز الموقف الأفريقي حول إصلاح الأمم المتحدة في إطار توافق آيزلويني وإعلان سرت. وفيما يتعلق بأعمال مجلس الأمن، نرى أهمية تعزيز مشاركة البلدان العربية والأفريقية المساهمة بقوات في صياغة قرارات الأمم المتحدة في مجال حفظ السلام، كما سنواصل تنسيق الجهود العربية والأفريقية على جميع المستويات، وخاصة بين الأعضاء غير الدائمين الذين تتداخل عضويتهم في المجلس بهدف تعزيز مصداقية مجلس الأمن والتأكد من معالجة جميع المسائل المدرجة على جدول أعمال المجلس بطريقة متوازنة، وخاصة تلك المتصلة بأفريقيا والشرق الأوسط ولا سيما القضية الفلسطينية. وفي هذا الصدد طالبت القمة العربية 33 التي عقدت مؤخرا في مملكة البحرين في شهر مايو الماضي مجلس الأمن بتحمل مسؤولياته تجاه حفظ الأمن والسلم الدوليين والعمل على تنفيذ قراراته المتعلقة بالوقف الدائم لإطلاق النار في غزة والحيلولة دون تفاقم الأزمة وتوسع رقعة الحرب في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. سيد الرئيس، يعد مؤتمر القمة المعني بالمستقبل المقبل فرصة مواتية من أجل تنشيط العمل متعدد الأطراف، وقد رحبت المجموعة العربية بالإشارة إلى معالجة الظلم التاريخي ضد أفريقيا كأولوية، والتعامل مع أفريقيا كحالة خاصة، وذلك في مساهمة المفاوضات الحكومية الدولية إلى الميثاق من أجل المستقبل الذي من المؤمل أن يصدر عن مؤتمر القمة. وختاماً، تؤكد المجموعة العربية على التزامها بتعزيز التعاون مع أفريقيا وعزمها على العمل بشكل جماعي لكل ما من شأنه أن يؤدي إلى تحقيق إصلاح حقيقي وشامل لمجلس الأمن ليصبح أكثر قدرة وفعالية على مواجهة التحديات والتهديدات الراهنة والناشئة، وضمان منع نشوب الصراعات في إطار أكثر تمثيلاً وشفافية وحيادية ومصداقية. وشكراً سيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and my own country, Luxembourg. We thank the Sierra Leone presidency for convening this debate and for inviting us to participate. The Benelux countries are proud of their close partnership with African states and strongly support Africa's leadership in advancing peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. We also commend the pivotal role played by African Union-led peace support operations and pay tribute to the African troops in peace operations, both on the African continent and across the globe. We recognize the legitimate aspirations of the African countries to play their rightful role on the global stage, including through an increased presence in the Security Council. A key step to achieve this objective is to ensure a comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council. Such reform is needed to make the Council more representative, democratic, transparent, accountable, and effective. Mr. President, I would like to highlight the following 4 central elements of the Benelux countries' position on the reform of the Security Council. First, any enlarged council should be more representative of today's world and in particular reflect the legitimate aspirations of the African countries. In addition, we support an increased representation of developing countries and small and medium-sized member states, including small island developing states. Second, the Benelux countries favor an enlargement in both the permanent and non-permanent membership categories. We support permanent African representation. The exact size of the enlarged council should emerge from discussions between member states on the key issues of categories of membership and regional representation. Third, the question of the veto is a key element of Security Council reform. The use of the veto has often prevented the Council from effectively fulfilling its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Special consideration should be given to address ways to limit the use of the veto. All members of the Security Council must adhere to Article 27(3) of the UN Charter, which stipulates that a party to a dispute shall abstain from voting. We must thoroughly consider and discuss the potential adverse impact of additional veto powers on the functioning of a future expanded Security Council and the overall effectiveness of the Council. Fourth, the working methods of the Council must be improved to ensure greater accountability and transparency. The Council's relationship with the General Assembly must be further strengthened. Elected members must play an even bigger role, including as penholders. More frequent field visits by the Security Council and sanctions committees can foster a better understanding and cooperation. We also welcome the enhanced consultations between the Security Council and troop and police contributing countries, and the strengthened cooperation with regional and sub-regional organizations, in particular the African Union's Peace and Security Council. The upcoming Summit of the Future presents an opportunity to translate aspirations into concrete actions. We need an ambitious and action-oriented contribution of the intergovernmental negotiations process to the Pact for the Future. There is very broad convergence on the principles of the reform. In order to achieve meaningful progress towards a comprehensive reform of the Council, we need to start text-based negotiations within a fixed time frame. We look forward to the presentation of Africa's reform model at the IGN, and we stand ready to work towards a consolidated reform model that meets the expectations of the African states and the wider UN membership. Mr. President, you can count on the Benelux countries' support to redress the imbalance in the UN Security Council and to ensure an equitable representation for Africa. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Luxembourg for their statement. And I will give the floor to the representative of Congo.
Je vous remercie de me donner la parole. J'aimerais avant tout vous présenter les excuses du président de la République du Congo, M. Denis Sassou Nguesso, qui me charge de saluer votre engagement personnel et partant celui de votre pays dans la défense inlassable des intérêts de notre continent, pour lui permettre de faire entendre sa voix sur les grands défis auxquels nous faisons face, en particulier dans le domaine de la paix et de la sécurité internationale qui nous réunit en ce jour. Au moment où l'Afrique s'emploie à relever un autre défi, celui de la gouvernance mondiale, pour prendre toute sa place dans le concert des nations, ce débat placé sous votre présidence revêt à nos yeux une dimension particulière au regard des enjeux que nous dicte l'environnement international. De plus en plus aujourd'hui, les réalités géopolitiques changeantes et les nouveaux problèmes émergents de gouvernance mondiale ont amplifié les appels à une réforme du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Comme on l'a vu ces derniers temps, votre Conseil s'est illustré par des difficultés à traiter des questions importantes de paix et de sécurité internationale de manière pertinente, équitable ou de manière équilibrée. Dès lors, la question que nous nous posons raisonnablement est de savoir si une plus grande représentation régionale ne se traduirait-elle pas en une plus grande efficacité dans l'exercice des fonctions du Conseil. Autrement dit, et c'est notre conviction, seule une expansion importante qui prenne en compte le poids et le rôle de l'Afrique, tel que nous l'avons vu ce matin à travers la brillante communication qui nous a été faite par Dr Sitemile Mbete, qui prennent donc en compte tout le poids et le rôle de l'Afrique pour accroître la légitimité et la représentation internationale au bénéfice de l'efficacité du Conseil. Monsieur le Président, les propositions qui ont été présentées au cours des négociations intergouvernementales expriment des positions qui sont pas proches des préoccupations africaines, dont tous pourtant s'accordent à reconnaître qu'il s'agit là d'une injustice historique qui lui est faite. Face à cette situation, il nous semble cependant qu'au vu de la reconnaissance par les 5 membres permanents du manque de représentation africaine, il existe une réelle opportunité de progrès concret en matière de réforme. Nous attendons avec beaucoup d'espoir la prochaine réunion qui se tiendra entre le comité des 10 et les 5 membres permanents au cours du mois prochain. Nous réitérons notre appel à l'occasion de ce débat pour une approche qui mette l'accent sur l'Afrique comme un cas historique particulier, qui appelle un traitement spécial. Reste alors à en tirer toutes les conséquences pour redonner à notre continent plus de confiance dans un système qui se caractérise de plus en plus par son exclusion. Dans cette perspective, il nous semble que l'une des voies plausibles qui reste dictée par le souci de justice et d'équité que nous recommandons à votre Conseil est celle de la prise en compte intégrale de la position commune africaine telle qu'elle a été adoptée par les leaders africains à ils unis. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, nous sommes tous d'accord pour dire que la nécessité de réformer le Conseil de sécurité ne s'est jamais révélée aussi impérieuse. Dans ce débat, l'Afrique a toujours recherché davantage de dialogue avec d'autres groupes régionaux. Le débat de ce jour, placé sous votre présidence, en est le signe éloquent. Il se situe dans le prolongement des précédentes interactions qu'elle avait eu à initier précédemment avec les 5 membres permanents. Mon pays, la République du Congo, renouvelle donc son engagement en faveur de changements réels qui permettent au multilatéralisme d'être apte à répondre aux défis les plus urgents, qui appellent la participation de tous, et en particulier celle de l'Afrique, dont, comme on a vu, comme les débats l'ont montré depuis ce matin, les situations constituent la majeure partie de l'agenda de votre Conseil. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, de votre aimable attention.
I thank the representative of Congo for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm privileged to deliver these remarks on a topic of great importance on behalf of Group of 4, that is Brazil, Germany, Japan, and my own country, India. Mr. President, recent global geopolitical events have clearly shown that the UN Security Council is unable to deliver on its primary responsibilities to safeguard international peace and security when the world needs it the most. The realities of 1945, when the Council was established, have long been superseded by current geopolitical realities, with the need for change being felt across the board. For the G4, the primary reason for the underperformance of this critical institution remains the non-representation of Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the underrepresentation of Asia-Pacific in the permanent category. As such, we are convinced that African representation in both permanent and non-permanent category will be an indispensable part of UNSC reform for a more representative and effective council. We, as G4, continue to support fully these legitimate demands and aspirations from the people of Africa. G4's relationship with Africa is anchored in trust and mutual respect and is focused on ensuring that Africa finds its rightful place in a new age of reformed multilateralism. In fact, the title of the debate itself is a clarion call for representation. Representation in key multilateral bodies is still not a reality for Africa and many other regions of the world, and it is imminent on us to correct this historical injustice, not only from historical point of view, but also from the perspective of future generation. This holds true. Africa is a continent with youngest demography, one with vast natural resources, expanding capabilities, growing markets, and most of all, rising ambitions. It is also inconceivable that Africa, which constitutes over 70% of UNSC's agenda items under discussion, does not get a permanent voice at the horseshoe table. Mr. President, G4 has walked the talk when it comes to correcting historical injustices done to Africa. Catering to today's realities, the G4 model of UNSC reforms has clearly proposed that the Security Council membership increase from the current 15 to 25 to 26 by adding 6 permanent and 4 or 5 non-permanent members. Among the 6 new permanent members, 2 each are proposed to be from African states and Asia-Pacific states, 1 from Latin American and Caribbean states, and 1 from West European and other states. On rights and privileges associated with permanent membership, such as the veto, we also support the common African position that as long as it exists, it should be available to all permanent members, both new and old alike. It is the G4's firm belief, shared, we believe, by Africa and other groups, that any reform of the Council that does not address the lack of representation, particularly in the permanent category, would only exacerbate the current imbalances in the Council's composition and render it ill-equipped to address today's international challenges. Much younger bodies like the G10 in the New Delhi summit held September last year, when AU was inducted as a full member, have shown themselves more willing to accommodate the legitimate needs and aspirations of the African people. Mr. President, please allow me to say a few points in my national capacity. As the concept paper poses questions on the next step, we see following imperatives. 1, adding references to common African position and majority support to expansion in permanent category in a pact for the future as it befits endorsement by our leaders. 2, expediting text-based negotiations in the IGN. Consensus is an output of negotiations. For this, the 80th anniversary of United Nations could be a befitting milestone. It is important that we do not keep delaying reforms, waiting for a consensus to emerge, as consensus can only be arrived at through text-based negotiations. The other scenario is of status quo, where reforms and representation are only elusive. That should not be our path. 3rd, we must push for reforms heeding to the voice of the young and future generations, including from Africa, where the demand to correct the historical injustices grows ever stronger. Otherwise, we simply risk sending the Council down the path of oblivion and irrelevance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Zambia.
Mr. President, at the outset, allow me to begin my intervention on behalf of the Republic of Zambia by thanking Your Excellency for organizing this high-level debate titled Addressing the Historical Injustice and Enhancing Africa's Effective Representation on the United Nations Security Council under the Maintenance of International Peace and Security agenda item. This is a historical event as it highlights Africa's aspirations to be represented in the United Nations Security Council. Mr. President, the need to reform the Security Council in order to make it better equipped and strengthened in its capacity to discharge responsibilities under the Charter in the maintenance of international peace and security in the face of the present geopolitical realities cannot be overemphasized. Africa must be treated as a special case and a priority during the reform process as a matter of justice for the continent. The African Common Position has garnered wide support from the United Nations membership, and it is now time for the United Nations Security Council permanent members to rally their support for the Common African Position. A more representative Security Council, which is also more efficient, was good but not good enough as long as that body is not at the same time more transparent, more efficient, more legitimate, and better able to implement its decisions. The presence of African and other smaller states in the permanent category would add and bring a vital presence that can add to the capacities of the Council. Time has come for the Security Council to be representative, democratic, and accountable to all member states, irrespective of status. This is essential for its integrity as a custodian of international peace. Given that Africa constitutes the second largest bloc of the United Nations membership, the proposal to reform the Security Council should hit Africa's core as espoused in the Ezulwini